There are a couple of pretty serious problems with the persons-based perspective that Degrassi is going to try to draw out and that we're going to focus on. What we're going to do is just kind of take these a couple at a time because um, it takes a minute to sort of absorb them, I think. They're a little bit surprising in certain ways. So the first problem, according to Degrassi, is that the persons-based perspective implies that, at least for human beings, we've got two deaths for just one biological organism. Because remember, on the person-space perspective, humans don't stop being organisms. It's just that that's not what they are, sort of essentially or fundamentally. Um, so humans still count as living biological organisms, even if we think that uh, the fact of there being persons is sort of the right starting point for thinking about death. Well, this means that, at least in persistent vegetative state cases, humans actually die twice because they die once when they cease to be persons, when they lose that higher brain functioning. And keep in mind from our earlier discussion of persistent vegetative states, the organism continues to survive. The biological entity is still there. Well, that organisms all die, right? And that organism will die again. That will be a second death for the human being when the biological organism dies. And if nothing else, that's real weird, right? That doesn't show that the person-space perspective is actually wrong. And in fact, advocates of the higher brain standard, one of them is Tristram Engelhardt, who's a bioethics professor at Rice. He refers to and describes persistent vegetative state patients as biologically living corpses. That's how he thinks of them. That's how he describes them. So he's basically affirming this claim from Degrassi and shrugging it off. I mean, that's one way to deal with this, is to say, yeah, that's an implication of this view. That's not weird at all. You might think that that's an instance of the kind of reinterpreting the meaning of a term like death in order to accommodate certain practical worries, rather than thinking that there's no core meaning. Because Engelhardt is in some sense acknowledging that human beings are biological organisms. He's just denying that what's important about humans for the purpose of assessing whether they're dead is not their biological life, it's their capacity for consciousness. So that's one kind of argument. You might think that that's just strange, right? Like that's an odd implication, and maybe it would be better not to have a view that has that strange implication. On the other hand, you might think that this is just obviously true on the person-space perspective. It's just that the person-space perspective denies that biological life is what's really important to thinking about death for humans. Now, the second objection is, in my view, a little bit worse. You can sort of decide this for yourself. It's something you should think about. But of all the problems, I take this to be the worst one, the most sort of problematic. And this is the objection that, on the person-space perspective, we were never actually newborns. We were kind of, it's not clear what the relationship is between us. We're kind of an iteration of the newborn that preceded us, but we're not identical to that person, to that newborn child, that is. How's this supposed to work? Because that sounds crazy, right? Well, according to the essentialist argument, consciousness is necessary for personhood, but it's not sufficient. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the essentialist argument. Consciousness is kind of it's the basis that you have to have. It's the capacity that you have to have in order to have all the other capacities that entail personhood. So capacities like rationality, self-awareness over time, reflective reasoning, things like that. A sense of yourself as responsible, you might think, is something that is important for personhood. You have to be conscious in order to have those qualities, right? I think that's uncontroversial to say that. And all of those things just become impossible if you're not conscious. Well, here's the problem with that. Let's take a look at this again in the form of an argument. So consciousness is necessary but not sufficient for personhood. Hopefully that's clear, because it's kind of the basis upon which the qualities of personhood actually exist. Personhood also requires other psychological capacities. We've said a bit about what those are. Here's the problem. Newborns lack these additional psychological capacities. They don't have a sense of themselves over time. That doesn't develop for several years. They don't have anything that could be described as rational capacities. Newborns don't do much in the way of reasoning. They just sort of hang out, frankly. and they don't seem to, in general, to have any of these other psychological capacities, even though they are conscious. I mean, clearly newborns have some capacity for consciousness. They cry if you pinch them, for example. Not that you should go around pinching newborns. Don't test this or anything. But this argument implies that newborns aren't persons, not because they're not conscious, but because they don't have the other capacities for personhood. Well, if that's true, that newborns are not persons, and we are essentially fundamentally persons, which is what the person space perspective said, that means that we were never newborns. I'll just pause for a minute to let that sink in because it's so crazy to say. Hopefully people understand how this works. I mean, the thought is just that if we identify ourselves as fundamentally or essentially persons, such that in the absence of personhood we would cease to be ourselves, then the newborn that historically preceded us is not identical to us. That's some historically prior iteration of us. And that is just a bizarre implication. I mean, you might think that that sort of is enough to rule out the person space perspective. You might just think that they need to say something about how to deal with this problem. So again, what de Grazia is doing here is showing that the person space perspective just has all sorts of bizarre implications. And if we want to avoid those bizarre implications, we should probably abandon the person space perspective. Now notice that the biological perspective doesn't have either of these problems, right? The biological perspective says, look, the death of the biological organism is death. There's only one death per person. And you are sort of biologically continuous with the newborn that preceded you, so you were a newborn. So we don't get either of the odd implications from the biological perspective, but we get both of them if we take the person space perspective. And again, remember, the person space perspective is the basis of the higher Brand standard. If we have to reject the person space perspective, the higher Brand standard goes out with it. The baby goes out with the bathwater, so to speak. Okay, go ahead and complete the question. It's about the "we were never newborns" objection, and then we'll conclude with a couple more objections, sum things up, and talk briefly about policy implications here. Because de Grazia thinks that even if we sort of accept or reject the higher Brand standard, we don't get stuck with the kinds of worries that motivated the Harvard Committee.